So let's take a look at Photoshop first. Right. And one of the things I just want to remind you of when you're working in Photoshop is just to remember that you can distort things. It seems obvious. But if you're trying to get perspective on something, especially if it's something that's a tube, you saw this the other day, you can figure out what the middle value of the tube is. And again, taking a few minutes to render things on separate layers. You can't draw this morning. There we go. Can also help you to fine tune things. So here we can balance out the light and shadow a little bit so that it's maybe not quite so bright here. And what I like to do a lot of times is when I have this together, I'll duplicate the layers. And then you can use your perspective tool to set up the perspective, but we've still got these layers separate. So if I want, we talked a little bit about focusing. If I want to have more highlight in this area for the part that's going to be in the surgical field and less highlight out here, then I can use my masking tools to just drop that highlight down a little bit. And the reason I push the masking tool is that they're reversible. If you make a mistake, you just flip from the black brush to the white brush, then you can go back in and bring back whatever you just masked out. So instead of erasing it and losing it, that layer is always there. Same thing goes for the shadow part here. We can drop that a little bit, but if it's too much, just come back in and make sure we got it. So you can see how, for anything that's going into a surgical field, you can, work really quickly with Photoshop to, especially with laparoscopic procedures and things that have tubular structures. And then on top of that, if we want to make sure we get our ellipses correct as well. So one of the things that you can do there is you can actually use the masking tool on the overall device here as well. And we can click and drag option, obviously, for the center. Get this lined up. Move that a little bit here. And what I'm going to do is just invert this selection. And I'll just paint out the bit at the end. And now we have our laparoscopic device, and it looks reasonably convincing. I hope what I just showed you is kind of a review, and that you've got some understanding of the layers, paths, and channels, and that sort of thing. But can I just confirm with you that what I did makes sense and you understand? Yeah, a little thumbs up there is great. I was talking with Jim and Glenn the other day, and we were Jim was mentioning that occasionally he gets caught where the things that we think are obvious and that you guys are used to working with aren't. So if this is a review for you, sometimes redundancy is good in learning, but hopefully it makes sense. Now, this is great for simple things, but what happens if you have something that's a little more complicated? Scissors, anything that's got a hinge joint, whether it's a flat hinge where you've got two sides that are opposing each other, or if you have something that's got a box joint. So anything that's going to be locked or is clamping something is going to have what they call a box joint. And that's basically where you have two sides. One of the handles has two sides and one of the handles has a center. And I'm going to get into that in 3D in a little bit. But that can get to be pretty complicated to draw. And obviously using your path tools would be a good way to go. Whether you're doing this in Illustrator or Photoshop, you can bring path tools from Illustrator into Photoshop, and vice versa. But I just want to do this quickly here for you guys so you can see when you have to think through a box joint. It can be a little tricky, and you're trying to be precise with this. So if we have something like that, You can see that this starts to get kind of complicated. We're trying to get some thickness here. We've got to bridge these gaps. There's going to be a lot of paths and things that we have to do to get these details dialed in. And whether you're doing this in Illustrator or Photoshop, trying to get these hinge joints and things together to look convincing really takes some time. And I'm doing this in sort of a side perspective, but if you're talking about doing this in 3/4 too, it can be really challenging to figure out how things articulate. So we're going to jump over to Maya for a second. And whether you're working in Maya or Cinema 4D, the same principles apply here. If you take the time to build something in 3D, you'll always have that as a reference, and then you can position it however you want, trace the paths if you need to, or utilize the edge tune functions and that sort of thing, and have some pretty convincing and well-rendered instruments without having to sit down and figure out all of the perspective that goes into creating these box joints. So you can see here, I just took a photo of a hemostat, okay? Just for my own reference, I opened it up so the handles are roughly 90 degrees. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to focus on modeling the back part of this handle, and then we'll take a look at how to integrate that into a box joint that I've already modeled. Okay, so we can take advantage of some of the primitive shapes here. So let's grab a torus for our handle here. We've got our torus. I wasn't paying attention to the axis, so let me make my life just a little bit easier, and let's put that, and we're in the top, so let's put that in our y-axis there. Move this over here. And what you're going to see here in a moment, and my advice if you're modeling instruments, is you want to keep things as simple as possible for as long as possible, meaning start with very rough, primitive shapes that'll help you move through the modeling faster. And only when you need to add detail are you going to want to start inserting edge loops and that sort of thing. So if we take a look at our primitive here, we've got our subdivisions in the axis and the height. If I change this, change these subdivisions to, for the height to 4, you can see that we're getting something now that's fairly simplistic. And the twist here, if I changed it to 45, you can see now we've got basically a cube shape that's extruded into a circle. We can change the radius of this a little bit. Not what I wanted to do there. The section radius, let's make that a little thinner. So you can see that's much closer now to the thickness of the handle. And by keeping this simple, I can now go in and make some fine adjustments to it. Maybe you can see it's a little oblong. And if I need to edit, individual vertices, I can do that. Because I'm keeping this simple, it's not going to take me too long to just go in and fine tune things a little bit here. Okay, so we've got a roughed out loop for the handle here. Let's take a cube. And let's extrude that. So I want to add as few divisions as possible in here to kind of evenly space things out. Right, but we've got this rough shape. We want to try to fine tune this a little bit. So one of the things you'll see is that it's a little bit wider. The handle's wider here a little bit. It gets narrower. And it kind of flares out a little bit. And we'll have to deal with this connection and the teeth. Once I show you how to do this, you can build that out. So a simple way to taper the handle is to just add a lattice deformer with your division set to 2. So basically it's going to form a cube around the handle here. And if we pick our lattice points here and scale them, and pick our lattice points here and scale them, we can kind of get this down to the proper thickness. And you can see I'm looking in the front view too. I've got this about the same thickness as the handle. This is just a little bit thicker here. If I delete my history now, okay, that gets rid of the lattice. We've got a nice taper. We still have some divisions. If I want to finesse this a little bit more, I can. But let's add a bend deformer to this. Okay, you can see I added way too much curvature initially. Just trying to get the orientation for the bend deformer, and then let's go to something like 2 or maybe 3 here to try to match that curve. And again, we can history. Now, if we still want to go in and fine tune this a little bit more, we could go in individually and because we're keeping this simple, a little bit of finesse to get the detail right. But because you're only working with a few subdivisions here, it doesn't take you too long to get that little bit of flair in there that makes the instrument look a little bit more realistic, okay? So lastly then, we have our handle, the 2 parts of the handle. We want to bring these 2 parts together. So we want to combine the 2 meshes, right? And then we could should be able to bridge these. And I'm doing this one at a time. You could do the whole thing, but then if you run into a problem, you're stuck kind of troubleshooting that. So if I do this, I know I've got it correct, and it took me all of 3 seconds more to figure that one out. Now, maybe at this point, we want to add a little more detail in between here, so we could go in and insert an edge loop. And then again, because this is fairly simplistic, we can just drag some vertices around in the top view to get this little bit of detail with the fusion of these 2 points. And maybe I'll set myself up here so that I can, if I wanted to extrude this out and edit the handle, the clip part of the handle, we can do that as well. So we've created our handle here fairly quickly, probably as quickly as you might be able to draw this out in Illustrator. And now we've got this in 3D. So if we take this and smooth it right now, obviously it looks nice and even, but it doesn't look like the handle from our photo reference. So we need to do some things to this to get that little bit of roundness. And I think I've mentioned this before from a surgical standpoint, but the only thing that's ever going to be inserted into the body that's perfectly razor sharp is going to be a scalpel or some sort of cutting instrument. Anything else that's going into the body is going to have some sort of rounded edge, soft edge. Even though these surgical devices are machined to be very precise, there's also machined to not cause any additional damage. So you want to keep that in mind with all of your instruments. And because we built this really simply here, let me just delete the history on this. If I want to round these edges over, all I have to do is go in and add some edge loops. So the handles, we want to maintain some sort of, a little bit of squareness on the handle, but then the finger loop itself is going to be a little different. And you can see here we've got the edge loop added on the outside. We need to add a loop on the inside as well. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now we've got a handle that's got a little bit of squareness to it. Okay. But the nice thing is too, is if you render this, you'll pick up a little bit of that edge. Now, if I wanted the loop of the handle to be a little less square, this again is where we get into the simplicity of this. If I pick my edge loops, and convert those selections to vertices, I could go in here and scale that in a little bit. And now if I look at the difference between the outer edge and the inner edge, this is definitely a little bit more round. If I could bring that all the way in like that. So if you think about this from a comfort standpoint, it's the inner parts of the surface are going to be a little bit more round to accommodate the surgeon's fingers. So something like that might be a little more, that's a subtle detail, but it might be a little more realistic. Okay. So we've got a handle. Obviously, you could flip this to create the opposing part. Same thing goes for any of the tips or anything that you might make. I'll just save this. let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at the box joint for a second here. So the idea with the box joint was that you've got two opposing pieces, and you need structure in here to keep the joint while it's clamping on something, to keep the joint from flexing on itself. So over the years, this has become the accepted strongest joint for any devices that are involved with clamping. And you can see that you can see that this rotates together, but you can also see how tricky it could be to illustrate that and get all the perspective correct and everything. So if you take the time to build it, if you're looking down the device, you at least have a good reference for your perspective. And then if you want to Photoshop or illustrate over the top of that, you certainly can. Also, you can see here, we've got these are all pretty similar, but if you build a box joint that you can then stick handles onto or different tips onto, you only have to build this once, and then you can build all kinds of different handles and retractors and that sort of thing. So let's look at kind of how we went about building this. What we have here is the completed handle for one side of the device. And the other trick with the box hinge is that the two sides aren't exactly the same. So you have to, the one side of the handle has the inner surface that it connects to, and the other side has the outer surface. So you have to build these two pieces separately. But if we start with some simple shapes, okay. You can see what I did here was I'm looking at modeling the outside of the hinge. So I took this simple inner shape, added some edge loops at the top and the bottom, and now to mirror these halves, I'm extruding a piece out of the top that I'll then combine here to give myself a flat surface to attach the blade to, and then obviously would do the same thing down here to attach the handle. Let's see, so here's an example too of how you can model. You could model a longer tip or a shorter hemostat tip. Here we go now, where we've got the outer part of the box hinge is modeled and completed. We've got a flat surface for the handle down here, flat surface for the handle on the opposite side here. And here's an example of how then that hemostat tip was attached. Okay, you can see I'm doing the same thing that I did before. I'm combining these two surfaces, deleting the faces in between, and then merging them together. And I'm keeping edge loops only at the most critical junctions right now, so that even though this is rounded over a little bit, when this is all put together, and if you look at it from a distance and render it, that's going to look like a fairly sharp edge. And now I'm looking at the internal part of the hinge, and you can see I've extruded out the top portion of this so that I can attach the opposing handle to that. Let's see what we got here. This all makes sense so far? Everybody's following? Good.
Yeah, I'll go, Greg.
All right. So by building these basic shapes, this particular shape, and then this shape, you can then add any tip or any handle to that. Obviously, you'd put an opposing landing pad here, and you know, once you have these couple simple shapes, you can build just about any instrument you want. Without too much trouble. Okay. So the important thing here is just keeping it simple through the process, only adding edge loops where you need to, and trying to just refine the geometry as you're moving along, and only adding detail when you need it. All right. So here I've a completed unit here where I've got the left and right handle. Okay. Obviously, though, I haven't set the pivot points up on this yet. So if I tried to rotate this, not going to work. So we're going to want to jump forward a little bit. But the other thing to point out too is these handles are straight, or these tips are straight. But if you want, once you build the straight version of the instrument, if you want to curve it, just like we did with the handle on the hemostat earlier, all I've done is taken a bend handle and applied it to the device after it's been completed, and now I can have either a straight tip or a curved tip, just based on the bend. And it looks like I bent each one individually, but you could obviously you could bend both sides together too. We're still not set up with the pivot point in the right location, so let's jump a little forward here. Let's see if we got this. Okay. All right, so in this case now, I've grouped the two sides together so that you can move the whole instrument, position it however you want. But now Now I've got my pivot in the correct location too, so I can work with that, bring that together to show clamping or grasping or whatever I need to do. Okay. And just an important point to remember too, anytime something's grasping or clamping, you're never going to have full juxtaposition of the tips of the device, because that would crush whatever's in here being dissected or held. So one of the things that's really tricky when you're illustrating any kind of clamp or anything that has a box joint is that you really need to see, rotate the whole thing. You really need to see that. So I'm just trying to get this where you can see a little better. You really need to see a little bit of an overlap in this joint in order to know that the device is not completely closed and crushing whatever it's holding. So even when you're illustrating that, you want to try to pick up that little bit of a detail. And let me see if I can show you an example of that here. What semester are we in? Okay, so my point here is that you can see there's a little space in between these clamps that are grabbing the broad ligament, so that they're not completely crushing the ligament. There's room in there for the portion of the ligament to exist. And in this case, I didn't get quite as deep into drawing the box joint here, just because of the scale of everything. But you can see how there's the implication that there's a little bit of a gap here, a little bit of a gap here. And the scissors look like they're coming together and cutting at this this location too. So let's see if I've got. Okay, here's a good example. This is just in a simple line drawing. You can see how the box joint is rendered. So you're seeing a little bit of the inside and a little bit of the inside on the two parts of the joint, a little bit of a gap. And those are very subtle cues, but what that shows is that there's a little bit of room for this needle holder to be holding the needle and not crushing the needle. And it's really important to pay attention to those types of details when you're working on your instruments. So that said, we've built our instrument. So let's talk about how we can now render that instrument to fit into our surgical scene. So just going to hide the lighting for now. I've duplicated this a couple times. So what I'm going to do is create a new standard surface. We're going to render these in Arnold. Okay. Let's call this base. And let's see, if I'm rendering this now in Arnold, we should not see anything because we have no lights in the scene, right? But our instruments are there. So let's get some lighting in here. And the Sky Dome light, I know we've kind of adapted this general lighting scheme where the Sky Dome light's casting a little bit of light into the scene to fill in the base lighting on the object. And you can see that we're getting a little bit of shading in here. But we need to add some area lights. I've kind of built my scene or framed my scene a little backwards here. Let's remember we turn off normalize. Let's just position these in a view that makes a little more sense. So again, once you have your devices in 3D, you can pretty much put them anywhere you want, at any angle you want, and you'll never have to figure out how to illustrate a device at that angle again. Okay, so we've got a different shader on the larger close-up one. We've got the base shader on these other two, getting kind of a weird artifact over here, which is the light punching through. So let's just back that off a little bit. And let's throw some reflected light into the scene. So we'll put that back down here. Flip it around. Scale that up. Let's make that a color so that we can keep track of it. And this would be a good time to think about the color. If you're trying to incorporate these into a Photoshop image for surgery or something along those lines, you might want to think about the color palette of your environment in Photoshop and decide if you want to bring some of that color into the reflected light on your instruments, so that when you bring them from Arnold into your Photoshop file, you're picking up some of the palette as well. Okay. So now we've got some light here that's working. I'm going to go back to the base material here for all of these. And you can see how clean the hinges are reading here too. And the edge is fairly sharp. Even on this one, maybe a little sharper than I would care for the edge. So I probably in hindsight would go back and maybe round this out just a little bit more. But the tips are pretty good. So now we just need to add some metalness to these devices. We'll swing this one around so we can look at it. From a little different point of view here. Okay. And at this point then, what you can do with your shaders, if we go to our base shader, we talked a little bit, I think, about presets for shaders, but if you're not familiar with that, once you have your shader selected, you can come up here and there's a whole set of different textures that are sort of set up for you, and you can replace or blend those shaders together. So I'm going to replace this with Chrome for a second because it's, you know, shiny instrument seems kind of cool, blah, blah, blah. The reality of your surgical instruments, though, is that generally they're not going to have a mirrored surface. If they're in the surgical field and they have a mirrored surface, they're going to be reflecting light back on the surgeon's eyes or the camera and that sort of thing. So you're never really going to see a surface that's that polished or that reflective. So choosing pure chrome is not really accurate, even though it might give you an interesting effect or look cool. It's appropriate for a car bumper, but not so much for a surgical device. So if we go back to our base shader here and say, let's go down to brushed metal and blend, you know, let's blend it at 75% and see what that gives us. Now we're getting somewhere where we've got some reflectivity, but not so much that you're getting a sharp contrasty highlight or shadow. So this is a little more accurate for surgical devices. You could play around with, you know, you could even play around with blending just a little bit of another material into it to modify the tone of the instrument a little bit more. And so now we've got something that's probably a little more accurate. Maybe we've got a reflected light that's going to help, that's going to pick up what might be some of the organs or the things where these devices are operating in the surgical field. One other thing you can do to add a level of interest and realism when you're rendering your instruments is you can actually assign a texture to the dome light. And that texture can be reflected back into the instruments as well. So if we take a look at our dome light color here, this is just one of these HDRI random images. But if you could even take your, if you were working on your color illustration, you could actually take your color illustration and bring that in as a texture map, apply it to the dome light, and then the dome light is going to use the values of that to light or apply, add light to your instruments. And the one thing that you may not have caught was that when you create a new dome light, the camera by default is set to 1, which means the light will actually show up and render. If you just change that to 0, you won't see the light in the background, but it will add a little bit of color. And I'll bring the intensity up on this too, so you can see the difference in the results. Okay, so now you can see with the intensity of that light up, you can see how the dome light's affecting these instruments. And again, this is a random scene from Utah, but it's giving some nice reflective components. If you take a little more time or dig around for some different images to add into your library as reflected maps, you can get a variety of different looks on your instruments. But the details like this are fairly convincing. Looks very realistic. You get a little distortion in the reflective components as well. And again, if you're taking your Photoshop file that you're working with, and the color palette, the organs, all of that stuff that are in there, and you apply that to the scene, then everything that you've illustrated is going to be reflected back into your instruments, and it will help to tie the instruments into your Photoshop file. Okay. Obviously, this is going beyond just the black and white assignment that you're working on now, but when we move forward to color, that will be important. Okay.
Okay, so today I wanted to expand a little bit on instruments and just talk about how to render and incorporate instruments into your Photoshop illustrations or anything else that you're using. And also, once we get through this little demo, I wanted to talk about rendering using Arnold and using the Toon shader too. I know a few of you had a chance to kind of play around with that, and some of you had some success figuring out how to utilize it. But I'll go through that for the benefit of everybody here so that you can look at some different options for compositing instruments into your illustrations. And then when we finish that up, I'll do a quick demo on arrows as well, since the topic of the week is arrows. So let's take a look. I've got this this instrument, this surgical rake, happens to be a device that's got some really interesting technical details, and this was one that I found online as part of a surgical kit. And because of some of the details in here, I might debate whether I want to model this myself to have for my own future use, or maybe I can get away with this instrument. If we take a look at this, so there's nothing in the scene right now. So let's just throw a light, sky dome light in here. And if we just render that quickly, you can see that there's some tessellation and some things in here that maybe wouldn't be ideal if you were looking at this up close, but this is part of a surgical scene, it's probably good enough detail to render. If you look closely at the model, the edge loops aren't very good on this. It's kind of jacked up. So that might, depending on how you're using it, would be a reason to consider whether you need to build this or render it, or I mean, build it or buy it. So that said, let's just a reminder with your sky dome light, you want to turn your camera setting and the light off here to avoid having the light show up in the background. And that also gives you a clean alpha channel for your instrument. Now remember, your sky dome light too is going to flatten things out a little bit. So if we're going to use this and get some good light on form going on this device, we definitely want to drop the intensity of our sky dome light. But I feel like it's helpful to have something that's just kind of filling in the device to give it a little bit of a value here. So once we've done that, we can add a nice area light. And hopefully at this point, some of this is a little redundant, but never hurts to be reminded. And we want to turn off normalize, bump our samples up just a little bit here. Take a look at where we're at. Okay, so now we're getting a reasonably decent rendering of this device. This is just a basic, a shader, whatever shader that the was on the device when it was imported. Which should be a Lambert. Yep. Okay. So if we just take a look at that quickly, though, just from the standpoint of light on form, and it looks like my Arnold render's acting up a little bit here today. So let's see what, see if I can fix that while we're working here. But just to get a general sense of light on form, you can see that even if you were to render this instrument and drop it into your illustration, you can get a pretty good sense from a basic Lambert shader what the form of this instrument is going to look like. Get this to cooperate a little better. That's better. Okay. So what I'm going to do, excuse me, is I'm just going to save this image. Make sure you have your color managed set here. If you save this as a raw image, the images are going to be a little dark when you open them up in Photoshop. So we'll save this as our first render. And it happens that I still prefer to work with Targa images because they're truly uncompressed, but you can work with a TIFF image too, and it will still save an alpha channel. So just if you're more familiar with TIFF, maybe we do that, and I'll call this instrument base here. Okay. Now, obviously, we want something that's a little more interesting than just the Lambert shader. So let's go to our hypershade. Create a standard surface shader. Let's give that a middle value. And take a look at our render again. So now we're getting a little better form. Boy, it's just going to be one of those days with the rendering here. Getting a little better form than we did with Lambert. And I think I could still use a little bit of a reflected light in this scene too. So let's throw a reflected light in here, this would be something, what I would want to consider is what is the palette of the illustration that I'm working on? Is it like a fleshy color, or if it's in the surgical field, is it a red or kind of blood color? So let's just say, for the sake of argument, this is outside of the field, so maybe a little bit of a skin color. I'll even go with something that's more like a betadine color under there, and we can drop the intensity of this a bit too. I want to boost the intensity of my key light a little, just to get a little more form. There we go. We're not really seeing much with the bounce light because, anybody remember why? Forgot to turn off normalize here. Okay, now you're getting just a little bit of reflected light coming up in here, which should be helpful as we move forward. So we're going to save this image here to say let's get base, let's say Arnold base, and then let's take a look at doing something with that standard surface shader. I showed this to you the other day, but just remember there's presets that you can utilize. So we've got a chrome setting here. If I were to render that, that's probably going to be a little too much going on here. So we want to try to soften that by blending it. With something else to kind of dial down that chromeness a little bit. And that's still probably a little too much. So come back in again. And the strong highlights are coming from my my key light here with the increased intensity. So maybe what I want to do is soften the edge of the lights a little bit, knowing that it's going to increase my render time a little bit, but in this case, we're not losing too much. And I'm going to add a little bit of roundness to this too. And let's just see if that kind of tamps down the highlight a little bit. You can see where the instrument itself, because of the way it's modeled, it's a little glitchy in some of these spots here too. But I think for the purpose of rendering, we can take advantage of this now. So we've got, we'll call this our beauty pass here. This is the, that term gets used quite a bit when you're compositing. And we'll come back to this in a moment too. But I also want to do a different pass on this. I want to create an ambient occlusion shader. And you'll see in a second here when I render this what that's going to do for us. You can pretty much, with the ambient occlusion, you can use the base settings to get started. But if we add that shader now and take a look at what's going on, you can see that we're getting some details with the shading and the tines of the forks and these holes and that sort of thing. And I can take advantage of that. to boost some of the detail in my instrument if that's something I want to do. Now, if your instruments are supposed to be secondary in a surgery, maybe you don't want to do this, but if you're rendering something for a medical device company, you might want to add an ambient pass to help bring out some of the detail of their instrument. And before we go any further, too, I just wanted to point one other thing out. You can see that the rendering of the background on this is coming out black. If we want this to have a different colored background, we can go to this environmental legacy option here, and you can see that there's a camera background setting as well. So if I change that to white, I can render my instrument, and now I'm getting that on a white background, which would be useful if we use, say, multiply to get this, to add some of this detail into the instrument. So let's save this as a ambient. Here. And then the last thing that I am interested in doing here is if I were working in a particular style with my illustration where maybe I'm using like a pen and ink style or a line style, I want to be able to get an outline around this instrument that I can use, and trying to render the instrument and then trace it in Photoshop or Illustrator is going to be a little cumbersome. So I want to try to take advantage of the tune shading options that are now available, and I think are working reasonably well now in Arnold. So if we search for AI tune, here we can we get this setting here, or this shader, and let's just assign that. And if we go to render this, nothing happens, right? We're getting just the sort of the gray shader. So there's a couple things that you have to do to get the tune shader to render. And one of those things that you have to do is you have to go to your filter setting, which is under the render settings, Arnold render tab. And you can see that we're set right now to a Gaussian filter. We need to change this to contour in order for the tune shading shader to render in Arnold. And if I do that, now you can see that we've got an actual edge around our instrument here. And if I look at the alpha channel, you can see that I've got a line now around this instrument. So that certainly could be pretty handy if we're trying to get this to be part of our incorporate this into an illustration that it utilizes line drawing and that sort of thing. So we can make a few adjustments to this to get this to give us a little more detail. But I do want to point out too, if you look at, as I switch back and forth between the alpha and the RGB file, you can see that the alpha line is reasonably thick here. And if I were to bring this into Photoshop and use the alpha to pull this line, I'm going to get the white background, and I'm also going to get some grayness of the instrument as well. So one of the things that you can do, this would be a case where if you're just rendering this as a pass for the outline, I might go back into my render settings and either break the connection here, or I could set it back to black if I wanted to. So now with this being black, it's a little hard to see the outline, but you can see that the outline is still there, and the alpha is going to pick up the black outline as opposed to the incorporating some of the white from the background. You could also, if you really want to be clever, I could hide my lights and render this. Now everything's black, but my outline is going to be a nice solid thick outline. Now, if we want to change the thickness of the outline, there's two places you can do that. One, you can see that there's a width setting here. So a lot of times what I like to do is bump the width setting up initially in the render settings. You can see that's probably a little too much now at this point, but then I can use my shader settings to control that. So there's a width scaling setting here. So if this was originally 2, I bumped it up to 4. If I cut the width scale in half, we're going to be back to 2. And if I want it to be a little more refined, I could even reduce that a little bit more. So let's go to 0.4. Now keep in mind, this is a rasterized image, right? So the resolution is going to dictate how clean your outline is. If you find that you're having a hard time getting a clean outline, you may want to render your instruments at a higher resolution, do the compositing for them if you choose to do that, and then reduce them to the scale to fit into your drawing. So just keep that in mind. Now, one of the things that's important here is you notice that we're not getting any real details in the instrument with the outline. It's just basically looking at the edge and drawing around the instrument. So the angle threshold comes into play here. And you can see if I reduce this to say 30, I should start picking up a lot more information. And sometimes you get things that you don't want, like some of these little dots here. Now, if this is just a still image, it's easy to composite that out or to touch that out. If this is an animation, you might want to play around with a little bit more until you find the level that you're looking for. But for now, I'm going to call this acceptable. We'll save this as and let's bounce over to Photoshop and start looking at some of these images. So I'll grab these. Okay. So here's my base, my outline, my ambient pass, my beauty pass, and this was the Arnold base. So given the choice between the two here, there's not a ton of difference, but I like the look of this better. So let's start working with this here. We'll duplicate our layer. Since we've got the black background on here, we want to get rid of that. So I'm going to go to load selection because I've got an alpha channel here. I'm going to invert that selection, which if I then hit delete will drop out the background. And for the purposes of our demo, we'll just throw a white background in here. Okay, we could have anything under, we could have our illustration under here, anything that you want, but basically we've got now our base here. And the reason I'm keeping this just sort of grayscale image is I've got some reasonably decent lighting and shading on it already. And again, if this were a medical device manufacturer, I want to highlight the device. If it's a surgical illustration, I don't want to overdo the detail on the device. I want to balance that out. So I'm going to keep this base for now. And then let's look at our beauty pass here. And I'll drop that on top of so we've got that. And then we have our ambient pass here. And you can see I'm just working with the alpha because the instrument's not changing. I'm working with the alpha channel that's built into the original file. I don't have to copy and paste and realign. I can just if I'm dropping these in with the shift key down, I know that they're centered correctly. So I'm just using the alpha channel that's built into the original base file. And here you can see with the alpha channel, you can see what I'm talking about if you look closely. That alpha is allowing a little bit of the base color or the base value to bleed through a little bit too. So again, sometimes if this becomes problematic, there's a couple things you could do. One is that I could shrink the selection or expand the selection before deleting the background a little bit if I needed to. In this case, I don't mind it. It's actually helping us out a little bit. So I'm just going to leave that. But it's important to pay attention to that. And if you find that by deleting or by subtracting or expanding your selection, you're getting a little too much removed or remaining, you might have to go back and render your device at a little higher resolution too, so that when you remove a pixel, it's affecting the image less. So now we've got our outline that we want to go back to. Interesting. I wasn't paying attention when I saved this from Maya, so it actually saved this as the RGB file. But what we're really interested in with this, although actually, here's how we can work with that. If we drop that, we drop the RGB file into our image here, we can use invert. Sorry, that's my selection. And that will give us our outline too. Now it looks a little pixelated because I'm actually in at 300% here. But if we take this layer now and say darken, let me just put a background color in here so we can see the effect that we're having. Same result, just a little different approach, but basically you've got your outline of the device now. And if we go back to our base drawing, we can make modifications here to get this to blend into the scene. If we want to soften it a little bit, we can adjust the transparency. Let's bring our beauty pass in here. And keep in mind that if this is a medical device, we want to focus on the device itself. If it's a surgery, we want our attention up here where the action end of the device is. So maybe I don't want all this detail in here. I can just simply throw a mask on and just reduce the amount of detail so that I'm getting a little bit of my highlighting. And maybe this is making the tip a little bit more interesting. If I've taken away too much, I can always go back in. But now we're using the details on the device to focus on the business end and call less attention to this area. And then if I add my ambient occlusion pass, and this is something where if I multiply this, you can see it's not doing a tremendous amount. If I want to boost that, I can always duplicate the layer, and now we've got a much heavier application of that ambient occlusion pass. So that's bringing more detail into this area. You can see where if this was if you're focused on the device, this is just helping the forks read really well, and the forks, the tines of the forks here and these holes are reading nicely. Maybe the way to do this is to, if you compare it to the pass without the ambient occlusion, I want to keep the detail focused on the forks. So I can take maybe this pass here and add a mask to that layer, and maybe touch out a little bit of the detail here, but leave the tines of the forks with a little more contrast. So now we're, again, trying to keep the focus and details down here. And then the same goes for our instrument outline. Where, again, we've got this nice rendering around the tines of the forks. There's some stuff out here that we don't necessarily want. So I'm just going to add a mask there. We'll touch out these little glitches. And I might even consider softening up the line toward the back side of the instrument too, just to keep our focus on the business end of the instrument. Okay. So that's it seems like a lot to go through with these different layers, but it's a way to help you really refine your illustration and keep the focus where you need it to be. You can see here I'm now going back and reducing the opacity of the base layer, so you can see there's still form here, which looks nice, but now we're really focusing on what's going on at the business end of the device as well. So for the purpose of trying to use this as a vehicle to direct your eye, having these layers and having this flexibility can be really helpful as you try to integrate this into your surgical illustration.